So you're going to hear about the Garuda a lot, but if you look at the actual symbol, it resembles an eagle. And so you have to understand that Indonesia has always been at the center of the universe in its own geographical area, simply because it's got every kind of natural resource you can possibly imagine. And so at one point, it was even called the United States of Indonesia, which makes more sense when you consider the fact that Suharto was supported by the United States against the more so-called communist-friendly Sukarno. And so this is probably the best example of the Garuda becoming more and more similar to the American eagle. And once you understand that any country with natural resources is going to be in play, a lot of it starts with familiarizing the people of both countries and with common symbols. That's what the flag represents. You look at so many flags have red, white, and blue. France, Statue of Liberty, America, and surprisingly, Russia. But you go back and forth, and when you're trying to go into a country and set up shop, a lot of what the private sector does is essentially install common symbols. And you can actually do that yourself just by learning the language. Within each language, there's a lot of common words. And that, quite frankly, might be the better way to figure out which countries have actually come in and, engendered familiarity with the population. And in my opinion, it's quite obvious that the Japanese were, in many places in Indonesia, well liked, because you see a lot of Japanese words within the language in Bahasa Indonesia. And I know that's surprising, simply because if you've studied history from a Western perspective, you're taught that the Japanese soldiers terrorized everybody. And it's absolutely true in some parts of the country and in some parts of the world. But there's no possible way that you could have had so many Japanese words, sampai, hanya, so many things. And I don't even speak Japanese, but I can tell you just by looking at the architecture that we now call Javanese, it's very obvious that the Japanese have been here for quite some time, and they have obviously integrated, because you don't see the Japanese flag here, you don't see any obvious symbols of Japanese influence. So again, linguistics really helps. It's not just in Asia. Look at Europe, consider the similarities between Italian and Portuguese, and then you can actually trace that back to religious influence as well. The ability to centralize documentation for marriages, for inheritance, for divorces in some cases. You look at all these things together and you start to realize that, to the extent that you want to study influence in a country, you really do have to study the language. And part of that is because, a lot of times the language that is used for business is the language that becomes the more popular one. And so Bahasa Indonesia took over Jawa, even though the indigenous language was Javanese. And what they say is, well, Javanese was too complex, it was too complicated, and so we changed it into something more simple. But in fact, Bahasa Indonesia is also complex. It's just that people have, for lack of a better word, made it more simple. So there are so many ways of saying danger. Like, for example, most people will say hati-hati, but in fact the full term is berhati. I mean, you can actually extend it and make it into a more formal, I suppose, a more formal idiom. Even just, terima kasih has become makasih. They've shortened it. And that happens with a lot of words. McDonald's in Australia is makas. And, or in the Philippines, it's makdo. And, you see a lot of people, a lot of forces, particularly with business, trying to make things more simple in order to facilitate, just better understanding between people. I'm sort of reminded of this back, and I was thinking about this the other day. Jesus spoke Aramaic, but the Hebrews, of course, would speak Hebrew, right? The people who were in charge of the, sort of governmental institutions at that time. I imagine, I'm not 100% sure about this, but, I imagine that there might have been a communication gap between the working class, who spoke Aramaic, and the people who were actually in charge of the banks and the business side of it, who may, and again, don't quote me on this, who may have been speaking Hebrew, a more formal language, obviously more formal, because it became the basis for Arabic later on. You can see that that's also very obvious. You can see that with the language again, al, it's so obvious. And then you can look at the culture as well, with circumcision, with pork, with so many different things, with the respect for sciences and so on and so forth, and philosophy and so on and so forth. So if you want to understand a country, you can start with the symbols, but you got to look at the language. And unfortunately, that's where it gets quite difficult, because how many languages can a human being learn in one lifetime?